Excellent. Right, so I'm going to talk through a very brief sort of potted history as to how we got to where we are in digital advertising and improvements that were made and where we are now in sort of 2017. But so, apologies for using the word digital after the last presentation, but back in the early 2000s, we had this sort of digital revolution, Web 2.0, which everyone would have been very bored of hearing about after a while if you're a little bit older than the average in this room. And at that point, we had this big usability revolution online. So there was this big focus on making the internet look better, be more useful, be a bit more user-friendly, person-friendly, however you want to put this. Whereas in the meantime, we had our ad revolution, which was completely different. So the focus was very much on automation. And so it was around how you can sort of automate as much as you can in advertising, real-time bidding, use of data, etc. And we kind of thought this sort of creativity, Mad Men stuff was for the offline world. We didn't really need to worry about it. So it caused a couple of issues. So bear with me, this is relevant to today as well. But one is just this single focus on audience, target, blah, 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 at the expense of perhaps doing something interesting. So you'd often find a great way of targeting right person, right time, etc., but not really think about what you do with that person when you get there, really. And we had this other issue as well, which is performance, performance, performance. So we picked on a couple of random metrics. It was usually CTR back in the day. And so you do anything to get that click, which might be totally annoying people. So quick example here, but where people had started to talk about blocking ads because of this interruptive experience. It's like catch the user, make them click on something, and supposedly that's good performance. CTR rate was good. Must be a great campaign, right? But no. But thankfully, this is the bad old days. And now we are in 2017, and we've seen a lot of improvements over the last, say, 18 months, particularly. So just to take a step back for a moment, I work at Celtra, which is it's a creative management platform. So we see a lot of the advertising that people have been working with, and going back from sort of early 2014 to now, there have been drastic sort of improvements over the years from people working with kind of annoying expandable 320 by 50s into things that are much more interesting, compelling, a better environment for sort of brand storytelling now. So we'd started to see things like consistent experience that's also tailored by device. So instead of this oddity where people would have kind of a big homepage takeover and then they'd have some random GIFs with some logos for mobile, we've started to see a sort of better cohesive experience. Yes, thank God people are building for mobile. And also a better balance of personalisation. So instead of following people around to show them what the fact that they had X pair of knickers in their shopping basket and they should buy these, after a while we began to get a little bit more subtle here. So ads have already become dynamic, relevant, but in a nice way. It's not kind of in your face in the way that it was before. So for instance, sort of auto-updating of dates as you get closer, slightly more relevant messaging. And of course, programmatic's improving as well. We've now got formats that actually work in the environment. It's not just about 320 by 50s. And also quickly moving on, of course, now there are some very sort of new and interesting engagement features, video, etc. All the rage at the moment. You can see it in the latest ad spend figures, which have just been released as well. So this sort of thing is starting to become a little bit more exciting. You're starting to find ways of engaging the user and getting them to interact with ads because the ads are interesting, not because you're trying to kind of fool them into clicking. But so this brings us on to present day. What's happening? Oh, almost brings us on to present day, sorry. Also, of course, interactivity to increase purchase intent as well. So it's not just about showing pretty pictures, but you can also bring people back to kind of inspire them to take action. But yes, so it's all changed. We've started to make this great focus onto quality, but we've realised there's much more to be done. And so instead of having individual parties start to say, oh, let's make some prettier ads, let's do something that's a bit more exciting and trying to do this on an ad hoc basis, there are a lot of organisations now that are coming together to make the web a better place. So we've got things like the Coalition for Better Ads, who've been looking at kind of what users like and don't like. the lean guidelines that the IAB have released, so we're starting to make ads lighter, a bit more efficient, JIT webs, ad.text, etc. And now also IAB Gold Standard, which has just been released. So this is great, but it's creating a whole load of new pressures on publishers. So this is not a pretty slide. But one of these big things, as Dilip mentioned before, has been huge focus on viewability as a kind of indicator as to whether a campaign is good or not. And of course, very important elements we need to look at as well. So sort of transparency, light ads, avoidance of latency, ad weight limits, limits on number of ad calls, etc. And of course, then you've got the Coalition for Better Ads showing people actually prefer 320 by 50s, apparently. So we've suddenly got a whole new set of issues to juggle, and life's become a little bit more complicated again. So theoretically, this new focus on quality ought to mean that we now have the best possible type of advertising. But is this what's happening yet? Only if you consider that the sticky 320 by 50 is the kind of best we can do in terms of advertising. So the focus on being as light as possible, as viewable as possible, has forced publishers to kind of take a step back. So we've moved back to the sticky banner again. So we just started to make all this progress, and we've seen a lot of publishers where perhaps it's kind of page break ads, your sort of teed style ad further down the page, into scrollers, etc., where you start to get a real sort of interesting space to communicate with an audience, has been kind of shut down again at the expense of doing something perhaps creatively a little bit more interesting. Is this a problem? Maybe this is the ideal format, but there are some issues with it. Just because something's 100% viewable doesn't mean anyone's actually looking at it or care. So you start to get low engagement. You could, of course, have a very pretty page break ads that had amazing engagement rates, but only kind of 65% viewability. Maybe it was a good ad. Maybe it was a better ad than a 320 by 50 at the top of the page. And of course, you're going to start to look at issues of banner blindness, which we had back in the 2000s as well with the old 468 by 20s, 60s. Yes, so there's this lack of space for brand storytelling. For consumers, of course they say they like those sort of ads best because it's as close as you get to no ad. So if you show someone a list of ads, if you showed them one that was like 1 pixel by 1 pixel, they'd probably go, yeah, thanks, I'll take that one, but I still don't want to pay for content. So we have to find the right balance. And of course, in the long term, for consumers, this might mean that the ad-funded model were to kind of deteriorate, or maybe less palatable means of monetizing content comes forward, things like data sales, etc., which aren't necessarily going to please them anyway. And of course, the big thing is nobody's going to say, oh, that's amazing, did you see that GIF on the whatever page? Because there's nothing you can do with this space. There's nothing interesting that you can do with it. So we need to take a step back and start to think about the bigger picture. So it's not just about which specific metrics are the best to look at any given time, but we need to think about, what do brands ultimately want? How do you communicate well with a user? What's the best method of sort of telling a story to that user? What's a fair value transaction? At the same time, of course, as reducing fraud, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of taking a step back, no CEOs, CMOs, et cetera, have ever said, like, as long as my digital banners are 100% viewable, all's cool. Because that's not the ultimate goal. So we need to start thinking about how we get to positive UX by emoting, etc. But so Forrester studies have shown 53% of consumers need to have some sort of positive ad experience before there is any material impact on marketing objectives. And yet only 27% of ads at any one time are actually considered to have a positive experience. For us, that's brilliant. That means that extra 73% is actually a massive opportunity. We need to get back to thinking about emoting again, being human. These ads work better, obviously. People like video. We need to make sure we're not blocking kind of new channels that are currently growing and working well and resonating. We need to stick with relevance. Whatever happens with GDPR, which I'm not going to go into at the moment, we still need to find ways of connecting with the user and serving something relevant to them. And yeah, there's a big monetary gains to be had here as well. So positive ad experience drive significantly more actions from consumers and are far more likely to increase purchase intent, a call to the company or brand, a follow-up, a like on social media, etc. But so something that was interesting, I noticed the IB were talking recently about, along with the gold standards, not just focusing on sort of reducing fraud, adhering to this kind of new set of rules, but also bringing value back to the value exchange. So the second thing that we absolutely need to start getting right is looking at the right levers for success. So it's all very well to say, let's take a step back, let's look at the big picture, let's look at brand storytelling, etc. But we still need to start looking at what the right indicators are for what's going to make a successful campaign. I don't think we're there yet. As a business, we're starting to look at the results of campaigns versus what happened, not just in terms of CTR, not just engagements, of course, not just viewability, but to start that sort of piece of analysis to see if there's something we can do better in terms of estimating in advance which sort of ads are going to perform well and which aren't. But so just to leave you on a quick quote from William Morris, artist, designer, but he always said, have nothing that you would not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. I think we should take the same approach with ads. It's not enough to say that the absence of fraud and the absence of irritation makes a good experience. We need to think about whether we're proud of the advertising that we're serving on our site or the advertising that we're kind of planning and putting out there across the media. That is me.
Thank you, Lolly. Before I invite the rest of the panel up, so emotionally, I'm totally with you there. You know, having worked in the advertising industry for many years, and thought about the fact that what you need is an emotional connection to your audience. But I've also sat in meetings with clients and with media people and whatever it is, agencies that look at you in a funny way when you start to say it's about the emotional connection that you can create. Even in the face of research like that, there's something sort of slightly heretical about speaking in ways that say it's about an emotional connection, it's about creativity, when you've got someone, and I totally sympathise with the client who's sitting there going like, yeah, but I'm just about to get fired because I can't prove ROI. Okay, there is a question at the end of this, right? And the question is, are you finding in your discussions with agencies, clients, buy side, that there's much traction for this way of thinking?
It's hugely variable. There are certain agencies that are very fixated, and in certain individuals as well, very, very fixated at the moment, specifically on viewability. And I've heard some brands directly as well saying it's fraud if it's not viewable. I don't want to pay for anything that's not viewable. Why would I? So it's in itself is quite an emotive topic. There are agencies such as Cara that are seeing the importance of the bigger picture and of how you're communicating with the user. I think, which is where it comes down to, I mentioned the sort of finding the new levers. I think we need to work out sort of some better indicators of success. And we've gone through this before, and we have a tendency to fixate on one or two things. I think what we need to do is come up with a selection of indicators and look at them in a reasonable way. Our Chief Product Officer, who's our co-founder, gave a presentation recently where he was comparing, looking at a campaign, the success of a campaign with, say, judging the attractiveness of a person. And of course, it wasn't about, say, you know, like, is that nose good enough? Is the mouth good enough? How's the hair? But you sort of take a step back and look at the whole thing. It's probably a sliding scale of different elements. And as an industry, we have a tendency to say, like, a butter nose is best, that's all I'm taking. Whereas actually, we need to look at what makes sense from the ultimate goal, not just I need to see some interactions, or I want X number of video views, and I want the dwell time to be blah. But we need to find out what makes sense, and then look at a sort of collection of, it's a kind of sliding scale. It'll be interesting to come up with something like an ad score, where you look at kind of what's an acceptable score. It might mean low viewability but high engagements, and all manner of other metrics that we haven't thought about yet. Yeah. That might be a fairer way of looking at things.
Okay, well, I think you've taken us in exactly the correct direction, because what we're trying to do today is not be driven by those by the concerns that may be the current industry preoccupation, and try to think about where real value is created and how it's created. And then, if we can do that, then we can think about, okay, how can we spread these ideas and how can we make it work? So I'd like to invite the entire panel to join.